The story most people carry about World War II is a story of clarity. There were sides, there were causes, there were monsters on one side, and on the other, men who crossed oceans to stop them. That story is not entirely wrong, but it is incomplete in ways that matter, and the parts that were left out were not left out by accident. They were removed deliberately, filed away, reclassified, burned in some cases, quietly forgotten in others, and in many instances simply never spoken about because the men who lived through those events understood, without being told explicitly, that speaking about them would cost something, a career, a pension, a reputation, sometimes more than that. What follows is not a story about monsters. It is a story about systems, about paperwork and procedures and chains of command that processed extraordinary violence with the same institutional calm that a government office processes tax returns. The most disturbing thing about what actually happened during World War II is not that people did terrible things. It is that terrible things were done efficiently, on schedule, within budget, and in conformity with regulations that had been drafted by lawyers and signed by administrators who went home afterward and ate dinner with their families. The war did not begin with chaos. It began with organization, and when it ended, the organization did not disappear. It adapted. The same filing systems, the same reporting structures, the same bureaucratic logic that had enabled 6 years of industrialized killing simply changed its letterhead and continued operating. The men who ran those systems largely continued running systems. Some of them ran the systems that rebuilt Europe. Some of them ran the systems that built the post-war intelligence apparatus of the Western world. Some of them were never asked to account for anything at all. Before the first shot was fired in what the West calls World War II, the German military had been planning with a precision that is almost academic in its thoroughness. The Wehrmacht did not simply invade Poland. It conducted a scheduled operation with timetables, logistics chains, and after-action reporting protocols. Officers filed reports. Quartermasters tracked supplies. Clerks recorded casualties on both sides with the same notational consistency that a shipping company uses to log the movement of freight. The bureaucratic machinery of modern war was fully operational before the moral catastrophe it would produce had even begun to register as such to most of the people inside it. This is the first thing soldiers were ordered not to discuss. Not the violence itself, but the way the violence was managed. The ledgers, the records, the fact that what appeared from the outside and even from inside to be chaos and destruction was in operational terms a functioning enterprise. Men who served in administrative roles during the war and who understood the full scope of what those administrative systems were tracking were specifically instructed, in many cases through official channels and in others through the unspoken understanding of their rank and position, that the contents of those records were not for public discussion. Some of those records were destroyed before the war ended. Others were captured and are still, decades later, partially classified in various national archives. In September of 1939, German forces moving through Poland did not only engage the Polish military. They moved through civilian populations in ways that were documented in their own internal reports, with language that was precise and deliberate. The term used in many early German military documents for the killing of Polish civilians, particularly those identified as intellectuals, clergy, or members of the professional class, was a bureaucratic euphemism. The action had a category. The category had a form. The form went into a file. The file was reviewed by an officer who initialed it and passed it up the chain. The officer who initialed it did not think of himself as complicit in murder. He thought of himself as completing a required administrative task. This distinction matters because it is not unique to the German military. It appears, in various forms, in the records of nearly every major military power involved in the war. The institutionalization of violence, its placement within procedure and hierarchy, was a universal feature of modern military organization in the 20th century. What differed was scale. What differed was target. What differed was the specific content of the orders. But the structure, the chain of command, the paperwork, the culture of obedience and non-disclosure that was shared. The soldiers who fought in the early campaigns of the war, on both sides, came back changed in ways they were not permitted to describe accurately. The military mail systems of every major combatant nation included censorship protocols. Letters were read before they were sent. Passages were cut, blacked out, or in some cases the entire letter was destroyed if it contained information deemed sensitive. What was sensitive was not only tactical information. Descriptions of what soldiers had witnessed that might affect civilian morale, that might reveal the gap between the official account of events and what was actually happening, those were also subject to removal. A British soldier writing home from Dunkirk in the spring of 1940 could not describe the full scope of what he had seen on those beaches without risk of censorship. An American soldier writing from the Pacific Theater in 1943 could not accurately convey the conditions of combat or the treatment of prisoners. A Soviet soldier writing from the Eastern Front could not write anything at all that reflected the reality of his situation without risking consequences that went far beyond censorship. The Soviet military postal system was not merely a censorship apparatus, it was a surveillance apparatus. Letters were not only checked for military information, they were checked for ideological deviation. A soldier who expressed doubt or despair, or who described events in ways that contradicted the official narrative of the war, could be arrested. Some were. This systematic suppression of the soldier's ability to describe his own experience created a historical gap that has never been fully closed. The official record of the war in every country reflects what governments decided the public should know. The actual experience of the people who fought it, the texture of it, the specific and often horrifying details of day-to-day military life, that record is fragmentary, incomplete, and in many cases deliberately corrupted. The second reality that was suppressed, particularly in the Allied militaries, was the systematic use of military justice to manage what we would now call war crimes. The American military in World War II had a functioning court-martial system. It also had a functioning system for ensuring that certain prosecutions did not occur. When American soldiers committed acts against civilians or prisoners that would under any reasonable legal standard constitute serious crimes, the decision about whether to prosecute was made by commanding officers. Those commanding officers had both institutional and personal incentives not to prosecute. A prosecution meant a formal record. A formal record meant the possibility of public knowledge. Public knowledge, during an active war, was understood to be a threat to morale and to the public perception of the Allied cause. The result was a pattern that appears repeatedly in declassified military justice records. Incidents were investigated, reports were written, and then those reports were filed in a category that effectively suspended further action. The men involved were transferred to different units. The victims, when they survived, were in occupied territory with no legal recourse. The paperwork existed. It simply went nowhere. This was not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It did not require coordination between large numbers of people who understood the full scope of what they were doing. It required only that the people at each level of the chain of command do what institutional logic told them to do. Protect the unit, protect the mission, protect the reputation of the force. The individual acts of concealment were small. The collective effect was the erasure of a significant body of criminal conduct from the official record of Allied behavior in the war. The third reality concerns the Eastern Front, which was a different kind of war than the one fought in Western Europe and which produced a different kind of silence. The German-Soviet conflict from 1941 to 1945 killed more people than any other theater of the war. Conservative estimates put the combined military and civilian dead at over 30 million. The actual number may be significantly higher because accurate record-keeping collapsed in many regions simply due to the scale of the destruction. Villages were destroyed completely. The people who might have recorded what happened there were dead. What soldiers on both sides of that conflict experienced was qualitatively different from combat in other theaters. The Eastern Front was not a war fought primarily between armies. It was a war fought against populations. German military doctrine in the East explicitly classified Soviet civilians differently from civilians in Western Europe. The ideological framework of the campaign authorized conduct that would have been prosecutable under the laws of war as they were understood at the time. German soldiers who served on the Eastern Front and survived the war were carrying knowledge of events that the post-war German state, and in many cases the Western Allied powers as well, had strong institutional reasons not to fully examine. The Allied prosecutions at Nuremberg were historically significant. They were also selective in ways that have been extensively documented by legal historians. The tribunal prosecuted specific categories of conduct and specific individuals. It did not attempt to produce a comprehensive accounting of everything that had happened. The German military's conduct on the Eastern Front was addressed in general terms. The specific operational details of how ordinary Wehrmacht units, not the SS, not the Einsatzgruppen, but the regular army, how those units participated in the killing of civilians, the enforcement of starvation policies, the execution of prisoners. Those details were not the focus of the prosecutions. Many of the officers who made those decisions served short sentences or no sentence at all. Some were subsequently employed by Western intelligence services. The institutional knowledge they carried was considered more valuable than the accountability that had been notionally established as a principle at Nuremberg. Veterans of the Eastern Front who returned to civilian life in West Germany, and later in East Germany as well, lived with a specific kind of silence that their families learned not to disturb. The psychological literature on this is substantial. The silence was not guilt in the conventional sense, though that was sometimes present. It was the silence of people who understood that what they knew, if spoken aloud in its specificity, would destroy the social fabric that they were trying to rebuild around themselves. It was the silence of institutional participation in systematic atrocity, carried privately by millions of men who had been ordinary people before the war, and who needed to be ordinary people again. The fourth suppressed reality involves the Allied strategic bombing campaigns. The British and American air forces conducted extensive bombing operations against German and Japanese cities throughout the war. This is not disputed. What was disputed at the time, and what was actively managed by military and civilian authorities, was the question of civilian casualties and the specific intent behind targeting decisions. The official position of both the British and American governments during the war was that strategic bombing targeted industrial and military infrastructure. This was the public justification. The operational reality was significantly different. The British bombing campaign against German cities, particularly the area bombing strategy developed and implemented by Air Marshal Arthur Harris, was explicitly designed to destroy civilian residential areas. The intent was to destroy housing, to kill civilian workers, and to break the morale of the German population. This was understood by the people who designed the campaign and by the aircrew who flew the missions. Men who flew bombing missions over German cities came back with knowledge of what they had done that did not fit the official description of their operations. They had dropped incendiary bombs on residential neighborhoods. They had seen the fires from altitude. Some of them had heard, in the briefing rooms beforehand, descriptions of the expected civilian casualties that were framed not as a regrettable side effect, but as a measure of the mission's effectiveness. The more civilians killed in a given raid, the more successful the disruption of German industrial output was expected to be, because civilian workers were the labor force that operated German industry. These men were not permitted to describe their operations in those terms. The official language of the bombing campaign was the language of precision, of industrial targets, of military necessity. A veteran airman who told a journalist in 1944 that the objective of his mission had been to burn down a German city would have been in serious trouble. The gap between the official description and the operational reality was maintained by a combination of formal censorship, the classification of after-action reports and targeting documents, and the informal culture of the air forces, which understood what was and was not acceptable to say. The firebombing of Dresden in February of 1945 produced casualties that the British and American governments actively disputed for decades after the war. The initial death toll estimates were suppressed and replaced with lower figures. Documents related to the planning and execution of the Dresden raid remained classified for years. When historians began to access those documents in the latter part of the 20th century, they found that the targeting decisions and the expected casualty projections had been discussed with a clinical specificity that the official accounts of the raid had obscured entirely. The fifth reality concerns the conduct of American forces in the Pacific Theater, which was characterized by a racial dimension that shaped operational decisions in ways that were understood at the time, but not spoken about in official channels. The war in the Pacific was fought with a different emotional register than the war in Europe. Contemporary surveys of American soldiers during the war found that a significantly higher percentage of men fighting in the Pacific expressed a desire to kill the enemy personally and to see the enemy exterminated as a population compared to men fighting in Europe. This was not a secret to military commanders. It was a documented reality that shaped how they managed their forces and how they managed the public presentation of the Pacific War. The treatment of Japanese prisoners of war by American forces was inconsistent in ways that reflect this. Some Japanese prisoners were treated in conformity with the Geneva Convention, others were not. The taking of body parts as trophies, including skulls and bones, was sufficiently common among American troops in the Pacific that military authorities issued directives against the practice on multiple occasions. The existence of those directives is documented. The practice continued. Men returned home with those trophies and in some cases kept them openly for years afterward, which suggests a level of social tolerance for what had occurred that is difficult to reconcile with the war's official moral framework. The shooting of Japanese prisoners was also documented in ways that suggest it was not rare. After-action reports sometimes contained language that, read carefully, indicated that prisoners had been killed rather than taken. The investigation of those incidents followed the same pattern as in other theaters. Reports were filed. They were not aggressively pursued. The institutional logic of protecting the mission and the force prevailed. What is particularly significant about this pattern is that it existed alongside the official Allied position that the war was being fought, in part to establish a framework of international law and human rights. The Nuremberg principles were being developed at the same time that Allied forces were committing acts that would have been prosecutable under those principles. This contradiction was not invisible to the people inside the system. It was managed institutionally by maintaining the separation between the official discourse of the war and the operational reality of how it was actually fought. The sixth reality involves the medical experiments conducted not only by German and Japanese researchers, but by medical and military institutions on both sides of the war that have received far less attention. The German medical experiments conducted in concentration camps are the most documented and the most extensively prosecuted. The Japanese medical experiments conducted at Unit 731 in Manchuria are less well known in the Western world, partly because the United States government made a deliberate decision after the war to protect the researchers responsible for those experiments in exchange for access to the data they had produced. This exchange was not a matter of bureaucratic confusion or unclear lines of authority. It was a deliberate policy decision made at a high level of the American occupation government in Japan. The researchers who had conducted experiments that included vivisection, weapons testing on live human subjects, frostbite experiments, and biological weapons development were granted immunity from prosecution. The data from their experiments, data produced through methods that would have been prosecutable as crimes against humanity under the Nuremberg standards being applied simultaneously to German researchers, was transferred to American military research institutions. The soldiers and officials who participated in facilitating this arrangement were operating under orders that they were not permitted to discuss publicly. The arrangement remained officially unacknowledged for decades. When it was finally documented by historians in the latter part of the 20th century, It confirmed what the logic of the situation had always suggested, that the post-war commitment to accountability was conditional, and that the condition was the usefulness of the people being considered for prosecution. The seventh suppressed reality concerns the systematic rape of civilian women by forces of every major combatant nation during the war. This is among the most extensively documented and most persistently obscured aspects of the conflict. The scale of sexual violence during World War II was enormous. It occurred in every theater. It was committed by German, Japanese, Soviet, American, British, French, and other Allied forces. The institutional response to this violence followed a consistent pattern across different armies and different cultures. When sexual violence was committed by enemy forces, it was publicized and used as propaganda. When it was committed by friendly forces, it was suppressed, managed, and when prosecution occurred at all, handled in ways designed to minimize institutional damage. The Soviet advance through Eastern Europe and into Germany in 1944 and 1945 produced a wave of sexual violence against civilian women on a scale that contemporary Soviet authorities acknowledged in internal documents while actively preventing from being discussed publicly. NKVD reports from that period document the extent of the problem and the inadequacy of official attempts to stop it. American military authorities in liberated France and in occupied Germany dealt with a consistent pattern of sexual assault by American soldiers against civilian women. The prosecution rate was low relative to the documented incident rate. When prosecutions did occur, they followed a racial pattern that has been documented by military historians. Black American soldiers were disproportionately prosecuted and executed for sexual violence, while white American soldiers who committed comparable acts faced significantly lower rates of prosecution and significantly lighter sentences when they were prosecuted. This pattern was understood by people within the military justice system at the time. It was not discussed openly. The veterans who returned home from the war carried the knowledge of what they had witnessed, participated in, or been told about in this regard. The culture of silence around combat experience that shaped post-war American and European society applied with particular force to this aspect of the war. Men who had seen things that did not fit the narrative of the just war being fought by decent men came home and, in most cases, did not speak about those things. Their silence was not only personal. It was reinforced by institutional expectations, by the social meaning attached to veteran status, and by the simple fact that there was no language available in the public discourse of the post-war period for what they had actually experienced. The eighth reality involves the food and supply systems that determined who survived and who did not, in ways that were understood within those systems to be matters of policy rather than logistics failure. The management of food resources in occupied territories was a deliberate instrument of policy for German forces throughout the war. The starvation of Leningrad was not accidental. The German army surrounded the city and made the decision at the command level that the civilian population would not be fed. The operational documents recording this decision are preserved. The logic was explicit. Feeding the civilian population of a besieged city was not militarily necessary, and the resources required to do so were more valuable elsewhere. What is less understood outside of specialist historical literature is that similar calculations, less extreme in their outcomes but structurally similar in their logic, were made by Allied authorities in various occupied and liberated territories. The management of food supplies in Greece during the German occupation, in which the occupying forces took a disproportionate share of available agricultural production for military use, produced a famine that killed a substantial portion of the Greek civilian population. The German administrators who managed this system were operating within a framework of rules that had been drafted by lawyers and approved by officials. They were not making ad hoc decisions. They were executing policy. The post-war narrative of the occupation of Europe framed these events primarily as crimes committed by an illegitimate regime. What received less attention was the degree to which those crimes were facilitated by the institutional logic of military occupation itself. a logic that prioritized the needs of the occupying force over the welfare of the occupied population, and that provided administrative cover for decisions that produced mass civilian death. The ninth reality concerns the fate of Eastern European populations who found themselves in the operational space between German and Soviet forces, and who were treated as resources, obstacles, or threats by both sides simultaneously. The populations of Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states experienced the war as a sequence of occupations, each of which produced its own wave of killing and displacement. The ideological frameworks of both German and Soviet policy designated significant portions of these populations as enemies to be eliminated, and the eliminations were carried out with the same bureaucratic thoroughness that characterized other aspects of the war. Soldiers who moved through these territories witnessed the aftermath of events that had occurred before their arrival, and sometimes participated in events of their own. The culture of silence that surrounded these experiences was reinforced by the post-war political situation. In the Soviet sphere, the history of Soviet conduct in Eastern Europe was controlled by the state and could not be discussed accurately. In the Western sphere, the complexity of the Eastern European experience, the fact that populations who had initially welcomed German forces as liberation from Soviet occupation had then experienced the German occupation as something far worse. The fact that some members of those populations had participated in German organized atrocities against Jews and others, that complexity did not fit the simplified narrative of the war that was being constructed for public consumption. The veterans of the Eastern European experience, both the soldiers and the civilians who survived, carried histories that did not have a place in the public record of the war. They lived in communities that understood, without formal agreement, that certain aspects of what had happened were not to be discussed with outsiders. This silence was not entirely voluntary. In the Soviet bloc, it was enforced by the apparatus of the state. In the West, it was maintained by the social dynamics of immigrant communities that depended on their host country's goodwill and that understood, from experience, the cost of being associated with the wrong narrative. The 10th suppressed reality involves the operation of the concentration camp system and the degree to which ordinary German civilians and soldiers who were not members of the SS knew what was happening inside those camps. The post-war claim of widespread ignorance among the German population has been examined extensively by historians and has been found to be substantially false. The camp system was not secret in the sense that its existence was hidden from the German population. Camps were located near German towns and cities. The populations of those towns and cities saw the prisoners, saw the transports, smelled what the camps produced. German soldiers whose duties brought them near or through the camp system knew what it was. What the German population and military did not, in many cases, know was the full bureaucratic architecture of the system, the specific operational details of how mass killing was organized and managed. But the general fact that large numbers of people were being killed in those facilities was not unknown to people who were paying attention. The post-war claim of ignorance served the needs of reconstruction. It allowed the majority of the German population to be classified as bystanders rather than participants in the system, which was necessary for the political project of rebuilding a functioning German society within the Western Alliance. It was not accurate. The soldiers and civilians who had been aware, who had known more than they later claimed to know, were not, in most cases, lying in a simple sense. They were performing the kind of selective memory that institutions teach people to perform, the ability to know something in one context and not know it in another, to hold knowledge that is operationally necessary while simultaneously maintaining the social fiction of non-knowledge. This capacity is not unique to Germans or to that period. It is a feature of how human beings function inside large institutions that are doing things that cannot be fully acknowledged. The 11th reality concerns the treatment of shell shock, or what we now call combat stress reactions and post-traumatic stress disorder, by military medical systems during the war. Every military in the war knew that combat exposure produced psychological damage. The evidence for this had accumulated from the First World War and was well documented in military medical literature by 1939. The response of military medical systems to this knowledge was not primarily therapeutic. It was primarily operational. The question that military medicine addressed was not how to treat psychological casualties in a way that restored their well-being. The question was how to return psychologically damaged soldiers to combat as quickly as possible, and when that was not possible, how to manage them in a way that did not produce problems for the institutional functioning of the military. Soldiers who broke down under combat stress were often treated in ways that prioritized rapid return to duty over genuine recovery. When rapid return was not possible, they were sometimes processed out of the military with diagnoses that did not accurately reflect their condition, which had significant effects on their access to veterans' benefits after the war. The treatment of psychological casualties also had a disciplinary dimension. Soldiers who exhibited what the military classified as cowardice or malingering, categories that overlapped substantially with what would now be recognized as acute stress reactions, faced punishment rather than treatment. Court-martials for cowardice were conducted by every major military in the war. Men were executed for conduct that modern psychiatric understanding would classify as a medical condition rather than a moral failure. The American military executed one soldier for cowardice during the war, Private Eddie Slovic, whose case became famous partly because it was exceptional. The British military had conducted mass executions for similar conduct in the First World War and had modified its approach by the Second. But the pressure on soldiers to perform through psychological damage and the institutional consequences for those who could not were consistent features of military culture across all combatant nations. Veterans who returned home with psychological damage that was not classified as a service-connected disability had no institutional support. The culture of the post-war period, which valorized veteran toughness and stoicism, actively discouraged the expression of psychological distress. Men who could not function after the war, who drank, who were violent, who could not maintain relationships or employment, were treated by their families and communities as personal failures rather than as people carrying injuries that had been inflicted on them by an institution that had subsequently discarded them. The silence around this was not imposed from above in the same way as some of the other silences described here. It was produced by the intersection of institutional failure and cultural expectation, and it lasted for decades. The 12th reality involves the specific experience of soldiers who were ordered to participate directly in mass killing operations. In the German military, these orders came through regular command channels and were carried out by units that were not exclusively or even primarily composed of ideological fanatics. The research of historians examining the perpetrators of mass killings during the war has consistently found that the majority of the men who pulled triggers, who loaded bodies, who maintained the administrative records of these operations were ordinary men who had been ordinary before the war and who, in many cases, resumed ordinary lives after it. The mechanisms by which ordinary men were brought to participate in mass killing are well documented in the historical literature, but rarely enter public consciousness because they challenge the comfortable division of the war into heroes and monsters. The process involved gradual escalation, the normalization of each step making the next step easier. It involved the diffusion of responsibility through bureaucratic structure, so that no individual felt fully responsible for the outcome of the collective action. It involved the social pressure of the small group, the unit, the platoon, in which conformity was essential to survival and in which dissent carried real costs. And it involved the framing of the action within an ideological and institutional language that made it possible to perform the action without fully registering what one was doing. Men who participated in mass killing operations and survived the war were, in the majority of cases, not prosecuted. They returned to civilian life. They raised families. They paid taxes. They did not, for the most part, discuss what they had done. Their silence was comprehensive enough that in many cases their children and grandchildren had no knowledge of it until historians began to access the records and, in some cases, to interview survivors in their old age. When those interviews took place, the men who spoke often described their experiences in ways that reflected the same bureaucratic framing that had surrounded the events at the time. They described logistics. They described procedures. They described the organizational problems of moving large numbers of people. The emotional content was largely absent, not because they were inhuman, but because the institutionalization of what they had done had provided a language that made it possible to describe mass killing in the same register one would use to describe any other administrative task. The 13th suppressed reality concerns the Allied use of German scientific and technical expertise in the immediate post-war period. The program known as Operation Paperclip, through which American intelligence and military agencies recruited German scientists who had worked within the Nazi system, is documented and has been the subject of historical research. What is less commonly understood is the scale of the program and the degree to which the decision to recruit these scientists involved a deliberate decision to overlook, suppress, or falsify information about their wartime activities. The scientists recruited included people who had overseen the use of slave labor from concentration camps in weapons production facilities. They included people who had conducted experiments on concentration camp prisoners. The security assessments prepared by American military intelligence on these individuals were in some cases altered to remove information about their activities that would have made them ineligible for the program under the regulations that nominally governed it. The people who altered those assessments were acting under orders. They understood what they were doing. The institutional logic that governed their actions was the same logic that governed decisions throughout the war. The mission came first, and the mission in this case was acquiring technical capability that was considered essential to the emerging competition with the Soviet Union. The scientists who came to the United States under these programs were told, explicitly or implicitly, that their pasts would not be examined too closely as long as they delivered what was expected of them. They lived in the United States, worked for American institutions, and built careers in a country that had officially prosecuted their colleagues for crimes that some of them had also committed. The contradiction was managed institutionally by the simple mechanism of not discussing it. Their American colleagues and employees generally did not know the details of what they had done during the war. The files were classified. The program was officially denied for years. The 14th reality involves the treatment of colonial subjects by European powers during the war. Britain, France, and other European colonial powers mobilized millions of soldiers from their colonial territories during the conflict. These soldiers fought in European and Pacific theaters under conditions that differed systematically from the conditions experienced by white European soldiers in the same forces. They received different pay. They received different equipment in some cases. They were disproportionately assigned to roles that carried higher casualty rates. And after the war, they were disproportionately excluded from the benefits, recognition, and legal protections that were extended to European veterans. Indian soldiers who fought under British command in the Second World War did so at a time when the question of Indian independence was active and contested. African soldiers who fought under French command were doing so in the service of a government that simultaneously maintained a colonial system that denied them basic political rights. The management of these contradictions required a systematic effort to frame colonial service as consistent with the political relationship between the colonial power and the colonized population, a framing that was maintained partly through censorship of communications from colonial troops and partly through the active suppression of political organizing among those troops. After the war, colonial veterans who attempted to claim the benefits they had been promised discovered that those promises were not always honored. The French Senegalese soldiers who were killed in the Thiaroye massacre in December of 1944 were demanding back pay and the benefits they had been promised. They were killed by French military forces. The event was suppressed in French public record for decades. It did not enter the official narrative of the French war experience in any significant way. The veterans of that massacre who survived were, for many years, unable to obtain official acknowledgement of what had happened to them. The 15th suppressed reality concerns the management of information about Japanese-American internment within the American military. Japanese-American men were interned along with their families in the early years of the war, and then, in a separate development, were offered the opportunity to prove their loyalty by enlisting in the military and serving in a segregated unit. The 402nd Regimental Combat Team became one of the most decorated units in American military history. The men who served in it were doing so while their families remained in internment camps. The contradiction between fighting for the constitutional principles of a country that was simultaneously denying those principles to one's own family was not something that could be expressed through official channels. Letters were censored. The political dimension of the internment was not a subject that military authority wanted aired in the public discourse of a country at war. The men who served in that unit came home to a country that was gradually beginning to process the legal and moral implications of what had been done to Japanese-American citizens, but the full reckoning with the internment took decades. Veterans of the unit who spoke publicly about the tension between their service and their families' imprisonment were navigating a public discourse that was not ready to hold that complexity. The official narrative preferred the story of loyalty triumphant over the story of institutional injustice acknowledged. The 16th reality involves the specific experiences of Black American soldiers in a segregated military. The contradiction between fighting a war against racial ideology in Europe while serving in a racially segregated military was articulated by Black American soldiers, intellectuals, and newspapers throughout the war, most famously in the Double V campaign promoted by the Pittsburgh Courier. The military and civilian authorities managing the war effort were aware of this contradiction and managed it primarily by suppressing the expressions of it that came through official channels. Black soldiers who filed formal complaints about discriminatory treatment were processed through a military bureaucracy that was itself structured along racial lines and that had limited institutional incentive to take those complaints seriously. Black soldiers who wrote home about their experiences had their letters read by censors who were attentive to political content as well as military information. The official record of Black soldiers' experience in the war was shaped by the same forces that shaped the official record of every other aspect of the war. The institutional need to maintain a coherent public narrative that served the purposes of those in power. The specific violence that Black soldiers experienced, including lynchings and other racial violence in the South before and after deployment. The violence they experienced in uniform from both white civilians and military police. The systematic exclusion from combat roles in many units and from the recognition that combat roles brought. All of that was documented in internal records and in the Black press and was known to military and civilian authorities. The decision was made repeatedly to manage these incidents rather than address their causes, to process each event individually rather than treat it as a pattern requiring structural response. When these veterans came home, they returned to a society that had not changed in its racial structure during the period they had been away serving it. Many of them had fought in combat and had experienced a world, particularly in France, where they were treated as human beings with full social standing. The collision between that experience and the Jim Crow South produced a wave of veteran activism and also a wave of racial violence directed at veterans who were perceived as having developed expectations that the existing social order was not prepared to accommodate. Veterans were killed. Veterans were beaten. Veterans were subjected to specific violence because their military service was understood as a challenge to the racial hierarchy. The military, as an institution, did not protect them. The incidents were documented and filed and went nowhere. The 17th suppressed reality involves the specific mechanics of how the Holocaust was known to Allied governments before the public was told. The British government had broken German Enigma codes early in the war and had access to German military communications on a broad scale. Some of those communications contained information about the mass killings being conducted in the East. The decision was made at high levels of the British government not to publicize this information, partly to protect the intelligence source and partly because the political and military implications of fully acknowledging what was happening were complex. American diplomatic and intelligence channels received information about the systematic killing of Jews in Europe beginning in 1942. The State Department, which processed much of this information, was not uniformly enthusiastic about receiving or acting on it. There were officials within the State Department who actively suppressed reports about the killings. When Treasury Department officials discovered what had been done with this information, they produced a report, initially titled "The Report to the Secretary on the Acquiescence of this Government in the Murder of the Jews," which documented the suppression with considerable specificity. The report eventually led to the creation of the War Refugee Board in 1944. The gap between when Allied governments knew and when they acted is not a simple story of ignorance or bureaucratic delay. It is a story of institutional decision-making in which the mass killing of Jews in Europe was weighed against other considerations and found, repeatedly, not to rise to the level of priority that would require disrupting other operations or policies. The men who made those decisions were functioning within an institutional logic that had its own coherence. Winning the war was the primary objective. Actions that complicated the achievement of that objective required justification. The rescue of European Jews was consistently judged not to justify that cost. The veterans who came to know, through their service, about the gap between Allied knowledge and Allied action, whether they served in intelligence roles, in the diplomatic services, or in the military units that liberated the camps and discovered the full scope of what had been allowed to continue for years. Those veterans were carrying knowledge that did not fit the public narrative of the war as a timely and committed response to genocide. The liberation of the camps was presented publicly as a revelation, as the moment when the world learned what had happened. For many of the people inside the system, it was not a revelation at all. It was a confirmation of what had been known and not acted on. The 18th reality concerns the fate of prisoners of war in the Pacific Theater from the Japanese side. Japanese soldiers who were captured by American and Australian forces were, by the standards of the Geneva Convention, supposed to receive protected status. The actual treatment of Japanese prisoners varied considerably. The institutional attitude toward Japanese prisoners in the Pacific Theater was shaped by the same racial framework that shaped American conduct in that theater more broadly. There is documented evidence of Japanese prisoners being killed rather than taken, of prisoners being killed after capture, and of a general attitude within some Pacific Theater units that taking prisoners was not a priority or was actively undesirable. The military justice response to documented incidents of prisoner killing followed the pattern established in other contexts. Incidents were investigated when they became impossible to ignore, and the investigation process was managed in ways that minimized institutional consequences. What is historically significant is not only that these incidents occurred, but that they were known to officers at various levels of command who made decisions about how to respond. The culture of the Pacific War, with its specific racial dimension, created an environment in which the killing of prisoners was not always treated as the serious violation of the laws of war that it formerly was. The men who participated in or witnessed these incidents came home with knowledge of events that did not appear in the official history of the Pacific Campaign. The silence around these events was reinforced by the same cultural dynamics that reinforced other silences. The meaning attached to veteran status, the social pressure not to say things that would complicate the public's understanding of the war. The 19th suppressed reality involves the use of chemical and biological weapons during the conflict. Both German and Allied powers possessed chemical weapons stockpiles during the war. Germany used chemical weapons during the First World War and had maintained and expanded its chemical weapons capability through the interwar period, including the development of new nerve agents that the Allied powers did not know about until late in the war. The Allied powers maintained their own stockpiles, partly as deterrent. Churchill specifically and explicitly advocated for the use of chemical weapons on multiple occasions, including in internal memoranda that were classified for decades. The decision not to use chemical weapons on a large scale in European operations was primarily a deterrent calculation rather than a moral one. Both sides had the capability, both sides knew the other had the capability, and both sides understood that first use would produce retaliation in kind. The moral framework against chemical weapons use, which had been established in international law in the interwar period, was relevant to public communications. It was not the primary factor in the operational decisions of military planners. The United States did use a form of incendiary that behaved in ways similar to chemical weapons, napalm, extensively in the Pacific Theater, including in the incendiary raids on Japanese cities that preceded the atomic bombings. The Japanese military used chemical and biological weapons in China throughout the war. Unit 731 and related programs produced biological weapons that were deployed against Chinese civilian and military populations. The post-war suppression of the full accounting of Japanese biological weapons use for the reasons already described meant that the full scale of this program did not enter the public record until decades after the war. The soldiers who handled chemical weapons stockpiles, who knew what those stockpiles contained and what the plans for their use were, who understood the gap between the public position on chemical weapons and the operational reality of military planning, those soldiers were operating under classification requirements that did not expire with the end of the war. Some of those classification requirements persisted for many decades. Veterans of chemical weapons programs in various countries lived with that specific kind of silence, the silence of a classified operational knowledge that could not be shared with family or community or the public record. The 20th reality involves the specific experience of the men who dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The decision to use atomic weapons against Japanese cities has been discussed extensively in public and historical discourse. What receives less attention is the specific experience of the men directly involved in those missions and the institutional management of how they understood and described what they had done. The crew of the Enola Gay knew what they were carrying. They had been briefed, to the extent that any briefing could prepare someone for an event with no precedent, on what the weapon was expected to do. The mission was conducted as a military operation with the standard operational procedures of a bombing mission. The aircraft dropped the weapon, turned, and left. The crew observed the explosion from a distance. What they were seeing was the destruction of a city and the deaths of between 70,000 and 100,000 people in the first moments of the explosion, with many more to follow from radiation and injury. The men who flew that mission were not monsters. They were military personnel executing orders within an institutional structure that had determined, through a process involving the highest levels of government and military authority, that this was the appropriate action to take. The decision was not made by them. The execution was. Living with the gap between those two facts, the institutional authority of the decision and the personal reality of the execution, was the specific burden of the men who flew those missions. The post-war experience of the Enola Gay crew is documented. The range of psychological responses from those who defended the mission consistently and without visible distress to those who struggled significantly in the years that followed reflects the range of ways that people carry participation in events of this scale. The institutional management of how they were expected to describe their experience was present from the beginning. They were heroes. The mission had ended the war. That was the public frame, and departing from it in any significant way was not encouraged. The 21st reality involves the displacement of civilian populations in the final stages of the war and the policies that governed how those populations were treated. The expulsion of ethnic German populations from Eastern Europe at the end of the war is among the largest forced population movements in human history. Millions of people were expelled from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and other countries where German communities had existed for centuries. The expulsions were carried out with violence in many cases, and a significant number of people died in the process. The Allied powers at Potsdam had agreed to the principle of these transfers, subject to conditions of orderly and humane execution that were not observed in practice. The men who carried out these expulsions, both the soldiers and the civilian officials of the newly established Eastern European governments, were operating within a framework of policy authorization that came from the highest levels of the Allied structure. The violence that accompanied the expulsions was known to Allied officials who were receiving reports from their representatives on the ground. It was managed diplomatically, which in practice meant that official protests were minimal and the transfers continued. The people who experienced these expulsions and survived them were, in many cases, themselves Germans who had lived in those territories for generations. People with no personal connection to the crimes of the Nazi regime who nonetheless found themselves subject to collective punishment on the basis of their ethnicity. This complexity did not fit easily into the post-war narrative, which required Germany to be in the role of perpetrator and not victim. The suffering of ex-belly populations in West Germany was real and documented, but it was managed politically in ways that prevented it from complicating the moral framework of the post-war settlement. Soldiers of various nationalities who participated in or witnessed the expulsions came home with knowledge of events that did not appear in the public narrative of the liberation of Europe. The distinction between the organized violence they had participated in, with policy authorization and official sanction, and the crimes of the regime they had been fighting was not always as clear in operational experience as it was in the official moral framework of the post-war period. The 22nd reality, and in some ways the most pervasive, is the reality of how the war ended and what that ending did and did not resolve. The surrender of Germany and Japan in 1945 was presented publicly as a conclusion, the end of something. The institutional reality was that it was a transition, the transformation of wartime systems into peacetime systems, the repurposing of bureaucratic infrastructure, the redeployment of personnel, the reclassification of records. The people who had run the wartime systems did not, for the most part, disappear. They moved into the institutions of the post-war order. Intelligence officers became intelligence officers in the new structure. Military administrators became occupation administrators and then became officials of post-war governments. Scientists who had worked on weapons programs of various kinds were recruited into the weapons programs of the Cold War. The institutional knowledge that had been produced during 6 years of industrialized war did not evaporate. It was transferred, adapted, and in many cases directly applied to the new geopolitical competition that began before the old one had officially ended. The classification systems that had governed wartime secrets were maintained and extended into the post-war period. Documents that might have illuminated the full extent of Allied and Axis conduct during the war were classified for decades under national security frameworks that were justified by the new conflict with the Soviet Union. By the time those documents began to be declassified, the people who might have been held accountable for what they contained had died, and the institutional structures that had produced the events they described had been reorganized into forms that were no longer visible in the same way. The veterans who carried personal knowledge of what had happened during the war aged and died. The silence they had maintained throughout their lives became permanent. Some of them spoke near the end, to family members, to historians, to journalists. Those accounts are fragmentary and incomplete. They reflect the specific things each individual was willing to remember and able to articulate, shaped by decades of living with knowledge that could not be fully integrated into the social world around them. The soldiers who had been ordered to be silent about what they had seen and done were following orders that the institutional logic of every military in the world tells its members to follow: security, discipline, unit cohesion, protecting the mission. These are not cynical justifications. They are the actual operational principles that allow large organizations to function under conditions of extreme stress. The problem is not that those principles exist. The problem is that they operate without distinction between information that genuinely requires protection and information that is being protected because its disclosure would complicate the institutional narratives that powerful organizations need in order to maintain their authority. The war ended on September 2, 1945, with the formal surrender ceremony on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The paperwork was signed. The cameras recorded it. The institutional machinery of 6 years of industrialized global conflict completed its final administrative task and filed the documentation. The systems that had made the war possible, the bureaucratic structures, the command hierarchies, the classification frameworks, the institutional cultures of obedience and silence, those did not sign any surrender document. They continued operating under new names and toward new objectives, carrying the accumulated institutional knowledge of what had been done and how it had been done into the world that the war had left behind.